We are continuing our study of Genesis. Chapter 40, is that correct? Or is it 41? I think it's 40. We'll be talking about Joseph in prison. Well, we'll go back just to get the background to be sure we know what's happening in verse 1 of chapter 40. But we saw last time that the brothers of Joseph had betrayed him by selling him into slavery in Egypt. So that's back in chapter 39, verses 21 to 23. Actually, I guess verse 20 would be the better place to start, just to give the background to remind us. I don't think we've forgotten in the last 7 days, but remember the false accusation made against Joseph. He's going to bring this up later, talk about how it was not correct, not just to be thrown in prison. Some have thought there's a possibility that the prison itself was operated by Potiphar. Of course, that was Joseph's master as a slave boy. And there was a false accusation by Potiphar's wife who attempted to seduce Joseph, who did not succumb to her blandishments. And she was scorned and thus turned against him and falsely accused him. So Potiphar had him thrown into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. So that's an interesting detail too. Evidently, these are political prisoners, sort of like the prisons in Washington, D.C. today. Yes, I'll say it, because I'm sure there are others there, but there are also a number of political prisoners in the United States. I know it when I see it. I used to see it on the island of Cuba. I used to understand what was happening there. It's the same thing, and I recognize the principle. But anyway, this is a place where the king's prisoners are bound. I say political prisoners, perhaps they actually did commit an offense. Maybe they really did commit a crime and deserve to be there. But at any rate, this is where the upper crust might go. So Joseph, in a sense, has it better off than he would elsewhere. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. I don't know, but throughout this entire whole section, there's just some kind of lesson that just keeps emerging. We've debated it or discussed it before. Come in. We've talked about the importance of doing our best. Here was a man who was blessed. I don't know that we have to infer that he was born with the brain of a genius. He was a very intelligent young man, of course. But was he superior in intelligence? His IQ level, in other words, just raw intelligence? Well, again, I think we would rightly assume he had a fair degree of it. But I don't know that you could say he was just the smartest man in the kingdom. There's something else, and that has to do with choices. So he makes the kinds of choices in life to bring about good results for him and for others around him. He's not only a blessing to himself, despite all of the turmoil in his life that comes from outsiders, but he's also a blessing to other people. So here he is, and the Lord's with him, and he's a part of doing meritorious works. So we could say, this king we're going to see, this Pharaoh, evidently was not so much concerned with cronyism as corrupt kings are in our time and corrupt politicians of our own country. Was not nepotism and things like that guided him. We're going to see in the next chapter, it's pragmatism. Who's the best man qualified for the job? Well, find the one who's doing the most work, the one who demonstrates that knowledge and wisdom, merit, based on merit. So there's something to be said for that, a plug to be put in for that. So the Lord was with him. And the keeper of the prison kind of turned the whole thing over to Joseph as the chief steward within the prison or trustee. Now, that's the background. Any questions or comments before we move into chapter 40, verse 1 of Genesis? All right. Here the record says, and it came to pass after these things, that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Now, I'm not sure what the ESV says, but I know butler here suggests a cupbearer. Is that what it has translated? Cupbearer. In other words, not a butler who stands there with a tuxedo and opens the door, but the butler in the sense of a cupbearer. This was a really important role to exercise in the king's court. because the king had to trust the cupbearer. He tested his wine. He not only would bear the cup, but if there were any doubt about its contents, if the king were being poisoned or there was a threat thereof, this is not Russia, I know, but still these kinds of things could happen even in Egypt, then he would be the one to first drink it. So he had to be a very close, loyal confidant of the Pharaoh, and he was. So also the baker who provided his meals for him. Those who cook for famous people sometimes can end up drowning in ponds under mysterious circumstances, and we really don't know why when they're capable, excellent swimmers and the pond is very shallow. This sort of thing happens as recently in our own country. So it's kind of dangerous to be that close to men of power, and we see why. It came to pass after these things that the butler or cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Now, no details provided. We don't even have any idea, but there are numerous ways that could happen. They might have looked at it in the wrong way. Whatever happened, it was an offense. So he was thrown into this special prison. And Pharaoh was wroth or angry against two of his officers. These are the officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard. Now that's the description of Potiphar. This is why it is thought he's the actual one who keeps this prison. He's over the whole prison. He's the warden. Into the prison on the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. And he served them, and they continued a season in ward. So temporarily they're thrown into prison for some offense. I don't know what it was. Maybe they held up a sign and protested something Pharaoh had done. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. The butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. So you can detect that in people's countenances. Their mood has changed. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. Now let's just pause and remind ourselves that among the ancients there was this belief, well founded in the case of the Hebrews, not all of them, but in many of their cases, that dreams would sometimes be revelations from on high, from God. That God could take the symbolism of a dream and could use the different signs within the dream, symbols that may have nothing specifically or literally to do with a subject, but which can abstractly point to a subject, another subject, and can use those to communicate something about what is in store for the individual, what is going to happen, and things like that. So that was the expectation that it could happen. Did it ever happen? Yes. And in fact, in this particular case, the record endorses the fact that these two men did receive inspired dreams. Now, the question might be this is just sort of an aside, but it's perhaps worth just noting briefly here. Are these followers of God, the true God of heaven? Likely not that they are followers of the false gods of the Egyptians. So they're not in God's covenant relationship, not even a patriarchal covenant relationship. And yet they receive inspired dreams. We come to the days of Cornelius in the New Testament, and the Spirit fell upon him and his household. So they would speak in tongues and perform that kind of miracle, and it would be an indication for Peter and the others who had accompanied Peter, the Jewish Christians, that God, in fact, accepted the Gentiles, uncircumcised Gentiles, as valid candidates for obedience to the gospel. Some have said it's impossible for someone outside of the covenant who's, we could say, alien sinner to receive any kind of miraculous measure. But evidently some sort of miraculous measure is occurring now. Now this does raise a host of other questions about which we have little information, and we have to be very cautious about wild speculation and cautious about contradicting what is clearly said about God's use of prophets and the gift of prophecy. So we could say, here in this case, it was an inspired dream, revelatory dream. But just how did God do it? Often the question of providence versus miracles intrudes into discussions like this, and we wonder, what is the difference? And so far as we can tell, we really don't know for sure how God operates behind the scenes. One has to do with the maximum amount of divine power, a miracle. The other, a minimum amount of divine power, the providential acts of God that still will bring about the will of God, affect his purposes in the world. So was this merely a natural dream on the part of these two men that God used? Well, it appears that at least his providence, at the very least, his providence is involved in such a way that it was not left to coincidences. This was something planned by God, the dreams they would have. So that they would have those particular dreams. Only God can foretell the future. And these are predictive dreams, we will see. Of course, there'll be other dreams from other people who are not even in the covenant with God, even under the patriarchal age. So they had these dreams, and they were disturbed by these dreams because they themselves had understood, not knowing the meaning of the symbolism, that these were unusual dreams and that they must have meant something about their welfare. And in fact, that was the case. So here it is. So we have dreamed a dream and there's no interpreter of it. The Egyptians had their soothsayers, I guess you could call them that. They had their magicians, and we know of that later in the episode of Moses and those who tried to throw down snakes to imitate his snake trick and so on, his snake miracle. So we know that there were those who pretended to interpret whether they could or not, but they're not in prison, and so they have no access as they would have had in the court if they had been back where they belonged. And the chief butler, verse 8, Joseph said unto them, this is a statement that we need to understand for this period of time in God's dealing with mankind anyway. Do not interpretations belong to God? Of course, it appears they all assumed the actual dream belonged to God or came from God, but the interpretations of the dream will have to come from God. Tell me them, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine, remember the butler's the cupbearer, okay? And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Sounds to me like unfermented grape juice. Duh. All right? I mean, clusters. So they did drink it. Don't let anybody deceive you about the wines of the ancients. They did drink that. So he said he dreamed that he put that kind of grape juice into his cup. And I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Now, that was the dream. What do these symbols mean? You've already read this, so it's not fair to ask, what do you think? Because we already have a leg up on it. But we could ask someone who's never read it, what do you think this means? And I'm sure the speculation would be just as wild as anybody else in prison that had tried to give some sort of consolation to these 2 men who were disturbed over their dream. So Joseph said unto them, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days, so time periods. There are going to be other symbols and other dreams later on in this narrative that also are time indicators. Just interesting to notice that some symbols are time indicators. 3 days. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head. Lift up thine head. Now here, this expression is going to be used with the double entendre. Well, in 2 senses. You'll see for the other man also who had a dream. Lift up thine head, in this case, is restore you back to favor. And restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. I don't know how long they've been in there for a while when they dreamed the dream, right? So they were in a season. Had been in there for a season, verse 4. So Pharaoh is going to make a decision about these 2. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, Joseph says to him. In other words, I did you a favor, I interpreted the dream. And show kindness, I pray. In other words, you have Pharaoh's ear. You go in and you serve him his wife. He watches you squeeze the juice out. That's a good way to show it's probably not poison too, unless they put poison in the cluster. And you'll drink it. So you're going to be right there. Tell him about me. Here's what I want you to tell him. Show kind. I pray thee unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. Verse 15. For indeed I was stolen away. Now notice this, out of the land of the Hebrews. Ooh. Is it their land yet? Well, there's a large tribe of Hebrews living in Canaan. There's a good bunch of them now. Do they have political sway over the entire region? No, not over all of what we know of as modern Palestine or you could call it the Levant, which is usually Syria and Palestine. But they are in a certain section of it. Remember, they were around Shechem in that area, and Hebron. So they bought some land for burial and things of that nature. So it's not completely theirs, but you can say that group of people there are the Hebrews. Indeed, I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that I should be put me into the dungeon, that they should put me into the dungeon. Why did they put him in the dungeon? Again. And whose was the... Right. We know the false accusation, and it was unjust. In other words, he was innocent. We know from the narrative he was. We know he did the right thing and suffered for it. So, does the Bible recognize the injustices in the world, that there are sometimes travesties when it comes to making decisions in court? Well, of course. And it wants to right those wrongs. For indeed, I was stolen away. He was kidnapped. Or was stolen away. He was sold into slavery. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, verse 16, he said unto Joseph, I was also in my dream, and I had 3 white baskets on my head. So here's what's this going to mean? And in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh. What does that say, verse 17 in ESV? Baked meats. Baked food. So he's the chief baker, and this is the sort of thing he used to do for Pharaoh. And the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. I think some of us might be able to guess the dream here, but we wouldn't know for sure. We might guess it's not good. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days, again, symbols for time. Before it was the vines, the blossoming vines and the branches of it. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee. So, same expression, but this time it has a sinister meaning. He'll lift up your head, all right. Some have thought he probably would cut it off and then take his body and put it on a pike to show dishonor to the body, which would have been a horror to the Egyptians, to show them this is what happened if you arouse my ire in the court. What did he do? We don't know, but it was bad. And the cupbearer had done something that wasn't as bad, so he was forgiven, I guess. Or maybe he learned that the facts were not as he thought. Anyway, within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Oh, okay, that's what it means. So, with good reason were they disturbed over their dreams, but one of them alone actually got good news and the other didn't. Now, it's one thing to, speculate, to pretend to be a dream interpreter, right? It's another thing actually to be able to do it. How do you know he really interprets the dream correctly? What would be the proof? This is not a hard one here. Yeah, it actually well, what does it mean to come true? Because there are some people in our day who would say, we're not really sure what's occurring in the physical world. We have to depend upon our 5 senses, and they deceive us from time to time. So perhaps we can never really know what's going on out there, what's happening, the Ding an sich. I think it was it Königsberg philosopher who had said, you can never know the thing in itself. Nonsense. You can speculate all day long. We can see, and they saw what happened in this history, the space-time, the temporal world, the space-time, matter, energy, time continuum. I think I mentioned time twice. And it really happened. So I bring all that up. Normally you wouldn't have to say that. Commonsensical people look at you with a raised eyebrow. Why would you say something dumb like that? Of course we know. But for our time, we have to tell people it's common sense. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. I guess so. He brings them up. Here they're singled out. And he restored the chief butler, that's the cupbearer, unto his cupbearership or butlership again. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, just as Joseph had predicted. Well, it actually was the dream that had indicated. Joseph just interpreted it. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Some have thought he had hanged, or you could say had hung, but hanged is proper with a rope. He had hanged him in some way. If it was, as we said, cut off his head and put it on a pike, then he hung the head on the pike. Anyway, he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet Did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him? Oh, really? I cannot believe that a human being would forget a favor. Here he was, this was an old prison pal, and he did him a favor and said, hey, when you're lifted up, I know you're going to be restored back to your place. Don't forget to put in a good word to me, to the big man, Well, he forgot. Not forever, but he forgot for a while. So time's going to pass. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, chapter 41, verse 1 of Genesis, that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. I think the ASV says Yeor, which is the Nile, may be the word for Nile. Now, the river is the Nile. Now, obviously, we already know about Egypt. Everybody studied that, even basic geography back in grade school, right? And we know the importance of the Nile to Egypt. And what is it in a word? It's life. Why? Well, without the Nile, where would Egypt be in terms of agriculture? It's a very arid area. It's an arid place. And the river inundates on average about once a year. It rises and floods the whole alluvial plain. Is that bad? No, that's good. They've already made provision. They know it's going to happen, so they keep their structures out of the way. Let it happen. And then as the water subsides, what settles into the fields? The silt of many, many miles. Rich, nutrient-filled silt coming from the middle of Africa. Washing down and going, continually renewing their fields with the nutrients that are needed for the crops. And also the water is provided. So there's irrigation as well. The Nile is absolutely vital. So Pharaoh, being king over the Nile country, that was the centerpiece of his nation, knew that if I have a dream about this river, I need to know what it means. This is not just any average dream. So he stood by the river. And he said, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine. Okay. Anyway, I had a friend years ago who, he's talking about people who had deviant sexual proclivities. He mentioned a certain individual. He said, I think he's one of them kind. Anyway, it's always funny to me when I read kind. This kind? No, kind, I think he meant. Anyway, well-favored kind and fat-fleshed. And they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kind, cows, came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kind upon the brink of the river. So you see the picture? What do we have here? We have a picture of fat cows and skinny cows. I won't say anything more about our assembly. No symbolism here. It's just, well, there is symbolism, but it's not about us. So they're standing on the brink of the river. This is the Nile, of course. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kind, they'd eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kind. Now, things like this can happen in dreams. They don't have to follow the rules of nature. We know cows are not carnivores, so that's normally not what will happen. But in the dream, it can happen, so we can use our imagination. So Pharaoh woke. So he had seen a really horrible sight. That's really yucky. You wake up, oh, these skinny cows ate these fat cows right by the river. And he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. I never get on corn, which is American corn, mace. I never get more than about 2. I'm lucky to get 1 on a stalk. 2 is about the most you get, but here we have, this course is probably what, barley or something, or different? What does your text say? Is it corn or grain? Grain. All right, grain. So it's not corn as we know, mace. Came upon one stalk, rank and good, fat and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them, and the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank or fat and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Again, much could be said about the subject which you do study in school sometime, known as epistemology. Big words should never throw us. That's not really a big word. I don't think epistemology is the study of knowledge. How we know. What justifies our knowledge of the world, for example. Knowledge, and that's a very important issue today. Our brother Thomas B. Warren, when he was alive years ago, Dr. Warren, he had his PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt, and he was a gospel preacher, a prince of a man. We've seen him on debates here. used to write in the spiritual sword, which I'm sad to see. Well, Getwell congregation that has sponsored for years is shutting down. In Memphis, there will be no more. And I think House to House, Heart to Heart is going to take up the publication thereof. We'll see what changes might happen. But anyway, back in the day, in the 70s, when Spiritual Sword used to deal a lot with meaty issues and with a variety of issues, he said epistemology is the number one issue of our time. And many gospel preachers laughed. They'd always laugh behind his back. I heard it. I was there when he was alive, and he'd speak, and they would smirk and say, get this, Dr. Warren's talking about epistemology, you know. Okay, you can make fun of it, but the thing he stated was exactly right. He could see it coming. He'd been preparing himself in the 60s and 70s in the schools in Nashville. He could see it coming. What we knew later is the postmodernist project, postmodernism, the idea that calls into question our ability to know anything with assurance. For sure, it's just a revamped skepticism from ancient Greece. It's just warmed over skepticism. I bring that up because in the Bible, there's a recognition between the real world and the dream world. We're not in a dream world all the time. We're in the real world. But sometimes we have dreams and we're in a dream world temporarily in our sleep. And the Bible recognizes it right here, a dream world. Okay, it was a dream. He woke up and realized it didn't really happen. Verse 8, and it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told him his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Could we have interpreted it? Well, it's not a fair question. We've read this too many times. But I don't know. I wouldn't know what that means. That's weird. But first of all, they'd probably say, cows can't eat cows. And grain can't eat grain. You know, they'd want to argue with the details. So secondly, they wouldn't know what it means. And this word got out that Pharaoh had this dream. He's disturbed. Nobody knows how. All the smart people can't answer it. But then, 9, then spake the chief butler, the cupbearer, unto Pharaoh, saying, remember, he's always there. He has his ear. I do remember my faults this day. In other words, I deserve to be there, sire. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. So, in other words, he did finally remember him after Joseph asked. It's 2 years later. Joseph sent and called Joseph, or Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. And they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee, that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, and this is where we see the beauty of this young man, his character. Again, he takes no credit. It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river. Behold, there came out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and ill-favored, and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kind did eat up the first 7 fat kine. When they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, for they were still ill-favored as at the beginning, so they didn't get any fatter. So I awoke, and I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good, and behold, 7 ears, withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. In other words, those 2 things you saw, the grain and the cows, refer to the same thing. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. So a number of things could be unpacked here. First, God revealed something in a revelatory dream. How much of a miracle is necessary? We don't know. How much the providence of God just nudges the chemistry in his brain, what he had eaten the day before, whatever, we don't know. But God did reveal something to him, And he's showing him what he's about to do. So secondly, God's going to be behind the events that are about to be related. The 7 good kine are 7 years. Again, more time indicators as we saw earlier in the other dreams from the people in prison. And the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is 1. So they refer to the same thing. He insists on this. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years. So you had the good cows, the bad cows later. The good cows. Okay, and the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. A surplus will accrue to them. Surplus food, grain. And there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land, because Joe Biden will usurp the presidency. No, he didn't say that. That's just an application, a modern application. It wouldn't be 7 years, we hope. Anyway, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. So seriously, getting to our narrative here, what we have is the prediction that you're going to have a bumper crop for the next 7 years. It's going to go well with Egypt. Then there's going to be a famine. What happened in nature? I don't know that we can say, we can surmise. There might not have been any rainfall whatsoever. Maybe they got a little bit. Could be the inundations of the Nile not doing what they normally would do. Maybe there's not enough snowfall back in the high mountains in Central Africa that would have led to the inundations of the Nile, the flooding. I don't know. We can only guess, but that's irrelevant. We just know that it's going to happen this way. So good news for 7 years. Just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? No. Let's make a plan. Here's a really good administrator. This tells us something about good government. Ironically, even a pagan like Pharaoh could make some good decisions, and he will. We'll see what he's going to do. And so verse 31, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. 32, and for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So God has decreed this is going to happen. Why? Well, when we go to the end of the story, it all makes sense. But now it's like, what did we do wrong? You can ask those kind of questions. Why, Lord? Why? See, Pharaoh and all the people in Egypt were unaware that God's working a plan for the salvation of the entire human race, way down the stream of time, way beyond this event, far off in the future. And to get that to happen, he's got to have the Hebrew people to come. Well, we'll see the story. Look, there's a whole overarching plan of God for the plan of salvation here. So God's going to let this happen. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise. So this is Joseph's interpretation or his suggestion. Since Pharaoh's listening and he's probably awed by, the sense that interpretation makes. It fits all the symbols. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land. So, organization. You have one chief who's over one thing, the food supply. He's going to take care of it and make sure that there will be plenty later. And he needs help. He'll have to have those who work under him. And let him appoint officers over the land and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. So that's the taxation. Heavy burden, but it's going to be necessary so that we can live later on. So we're going to take a 5th part of everything in the next 7 years, and they could afford to do it. It's a bumper crop, remember? Nobody's going to go hungry in those 7 years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh and let them keep food in the cities. That makes sense, where they can be watched, protected. There'd be a cadre of soldiers perhaps if needed, so people wouldn't break in to steal the grain later. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. So it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Egypt's going to have to go through famine later, but Egypt will be protected. And how? Because somebody made the mistake of wanting to kill their brother and then deciding just to sell him into slavery. And he ended up in Potiphar's house. And somebody made the mistake of trying to seduce him and falsely accuse him, and he ended up in prison. And now there's going to be a famine, and somebody's got to be over this. Who would be smart enough? Or let's just say, no, not smart. That's not the right word here. It's misleading. Who would be dependable enough? I think. Dependable. I'm wondering here in the narrative, who have we seen to be very dependable? I mean, it's just a small thing. Potiphar's house. That was a small thing, but he was dependable. And then in prison, well, he was the best prisoner. He was a model prisoner. Small thing. But if you prove yourself in small things, you know the principle, right? If you're faithful in that which is least, you are faithful in that which is much, Jesus would say. So, the food should be stored so the land not perish. Verse 37, and the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Now, if this were a modern regime by people who are secularists and who have no respect for anything higher than their heads, they would first of all look to, how can I get rich off of this? This would be what our present administration would think, probably. How do I and my family benefit from all this? Where do we get the money? Am I being cynical or a realist? And that's not just this country. That's been true of Latin America for years. A Catholic country. What would happen if we had Catholics in... Oh, I see. All right. So it's just not one that takes seriously moral principles. Another thing would be, how can my family be enriched? Who can I point of my kinfolks over this? That's the way many low-minded politicos of our time think. You know, that's the way they normally think. But Pharaoh's a pretty astute leader. He's a good leader. So the thing was good in the eyes of his... Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this, and a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Who's he talking about? Well, Joseph. And he knew the Spirit of God was in Joseph because of the fact that these dreams, the symbolism all fit. They made sense. It was not a crazy, outlandish thing. He didn't say Martians would be landing and, taking over the world. Nothing dumb like that. It was just, this can happen. These sorts of things occur from time to time. Normal climate change or whatever would bring it about. So the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh. He wanted to know, could we find anybody better? In verse 39, this is a meritocracy in Egypt at this time. Based on merit, not kinship or what you can do for me. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto the word shall all my people be ruled. Unto whose word? Joseph's. So he starts out as a little boy who's mistreated by his siblings, thrown into a pit, sold off into slavery, thrown into prison. And the next thing you know, this foreigner, this Hebrew, is over the land of Egypt. I won't go into all this. We know in Egyptian history it's notoriously difficult to mesh Egyptian chronology with biblical chronology. It's really hard to do, although we have some pretty good indicators sometimes. There are various theories. One view is that of the Hyksos, who were a Semitic people who ended up ruling in Egypt for a period of time. But I don't know that we can associate the rule of Joseph with the Hyksos rule. That's just an aside, as a thought sometimes comes. It's just really hard to harmonize the chronology. So he said unto him, there's none so discreet. You will be... Under thy word shall all my people be ruled. Why would Joseph need to be given authority? What is the project before Joseph now? Well, we know what's about to happen. You have to be smart the first 7 years because you know that lean years are coming. So in the first 7 years, you have to set aside what you need for those lean years. Now, that's a wise course in anybody's household, right? So somebody to do that has to have the authority. Would there be resistance? Perhaps. Let's just say that the word just got out just by rumors. There may be coming 7 years of famine later. A lot of people would try to make a fast buck in the first 7 years, wouldn't they? That's just human nature, sinful. And they would probably get in the way of the project to set aside the grain in the granaries. You've got to have some authority to get it done. So Joseph is given political authority. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. So this means that this Hebrew boy, this former slave, is now and prisoner, is now going to be the second in command in one of the greatest empires in world history. At the time, perhaps the greatest. Ooh, this is a major uplifting of Joseph. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I've set over thee all the land of Egypt. I wonder if there was any jealousy against him by some of the Egyptian officials who didn't get the call to do that. Probably. Maybe helps us understand modern anti-Semitism. I don't know. And again, I'm not here putting in a plug especially for the Jews. They're maddening in a way. Maddening in this sense. They were God's chosen people who brought to the world salvation. They brought our Savior. And yet they continue, by and large, to reject Him as the Savior. And because of that arrogance, too, that often goes with thinking themselves of being the special, chosen ones of God still, it's a maddening thing. And yet we have to be realistic. We understand what happened in history, who they were, and then where they went astray. But here, nobody's going astray yet. Joseph is just doing his job, and there would be envy perhaps. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand. That's a big deal. And arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, cotton. Even today, Egypt grows a lot of cotton. And put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, "Bow the knee!" Before whom? Joseph, a Hebrew boy. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. We know the exception. He would be the top one. But he basically had entrusted it all to Joseph, who would run the affairs smoothly. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Everybody's got to go through you. I'm delegating that authority." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah. I like Joseph. It's a little easier. Anyway, that was his Egyptian name. And gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. How old was Joseph? Verse 46, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the field which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. Of course, that's the way it works. This is accurate description. Agriculture in the fields outside the city, you bring it into the central place where you hold it in the city. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. So it's just too big a figure to even keep the books on. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God, said he, hath made me forget all my toil. I think it means something like forgetfulness. So all the bad things that had happened, he didn't continually dwell on those and sulk about it. I can't believe my brothers treated me that way. I can't believe that Potiphar's wife lied about me as she did. But that was not the way he was motivated. Here's a man who's looking ahead. He's looking to the future. He's forgotten that. And all my father's house. And the name of the second son he called Ephraim. So it looks like we sometimes forget this, that in the Hebrew nation, in the land of Israel, there was a mixture of some Egyptian blood, right? All right, so these wives of his. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So those will later be the heads of the 2 tribes of Joseph. They're known as the Joseph tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Joseph's name will not actually be used, but his sons' names, to refer to those tribes. Verse 53, and the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended. And the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph hath said. And the dearth was in all lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So let me go back and rephrase something when I was speculating. Evidently it involved climate change. Not just, well, that could have affected the river too, climate change, if there had been drought down in Central Africa and there was very little snow in the mountains in those years, that would have been part of the reason for the Nile's problems. But even in Canaan, which did not depend on the river Nile, but depend on rainwater, there's going to be famine. Verse 55, when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Come in, brother. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, go unto Joseph. What he saith to you, do. That had been the plan from the beginning, had it not been. And Joseph had been making the preparations. Knew where all the granaries were. had all the books on them and so on. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. Now, here's a question you could ask. It's silly in a way. You don't want to just guess about things. But why did he not just give it out to the people? Would it not have been good to have a socialist system set up here where in these 7 years you just handed out maybe to each according to his need? Well, they didn't take it necessarily from each according to his ability. Actually, in a sense they did, because when they worked hard, they grew a lot of crops in the 7 plenteous years. So they had a lot of surplus. But there has to be a way to dispense with this fairly and equitably. And what better way than people who work and earn what they can, even under the drought circumstances, for them to come and take the money they have and purchase the grain. I mean, there was a lot of administrative costs that went into this. It's only fair, is it not? It's only fair. So I think it was done equitably and fairly in that sense. And the famine was over all the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses so in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands. Let's just read a little bit more. It's just getting really good now, because we see that Egypt is the Mecca, you might say. I shouldn't have said that. That's an insult to Egypt. Egypt is the attraction for the world. Now, when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, where's Jacob? He's in the land of the Hebrews, as it was said earlier. Remember, in Canaan. And he thinks his son Joseph died years ago. He knows nothing about the grand vizier. I think they call him as the vizier of Egypt, would be the second in command, Joseph. Jacob said unto his sons, why do you look one upon another? In other words, that's what you call moping, isn't it? Oh, we're going to die. There's nothing to eat anymore. I can't feed my family. I guess that's the idea. Why are you just sitting around? Get busy. That's maybe a chop off the old block Joseph had, right? When he's a man of action. Behold, I've heard there's corn in Egypt. Get you down thither and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And Joseph's 10 brethren went down to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob, sent not with his brethren, for he said, lest peradventure mischief befall him. Wow, as a father, those just strike the tender chords, don't they? You just feel it. I'm not going to risk my other son, because he already lost Joseph, his favorite son. The two favorites, Joseph and Benjamin. I'm not going to send this young boy down here. Something bad could happen, so he's going to stay here. And the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. In other words, he had contact, I guess, with the sheikhs and other important men who came in to do business. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. Would they bow down to Joseph? I mean, here, no, I'm not asking about prophecies. Why would they bow down? Well, who is he? He's the governor over all Egypt. Egypt, second in command. A hugely important political figure. So it's just a privilege to be able to come and ask, may we buy also? Especially since they're foreigners, at least from their point of view, as they would view themselves with reference to him. So they didn't recognize him. Obviously, they did not recognize that this is their brother Joseph. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. Just again, going back, everything goes back full circle. That had been foreshadowed in the dreams of Joseph, that his brothers would bow down to him, remember? And they had no idea when and where that could ever be fulfilled, and probably thought it never would be, because they thought they got rid of the dreamer. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And he said unto them, whence come ye? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew not him. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them, and said unto them, ye are spies, to come to see the nakedness of the land ye are come. And they said unto him, nay, my Lord, but to buy food are thy servants come. We are all one man's sons. You know, this is not how spies normally work. The foolish communists said, you're a spy to me. And when they arrested me in Cuba, And your father is too, that old man that comes with you. He's an agent for the CIA. And after I finished laughing them to scorn, I explained to them, doesn't make any sense. If you knew where we lived, and they probably did, I think they sent spies here. But if you knew where we lived out in rural Carroll County, Georgia, in the middle of the country, and I don't have any money. If I were in the CIA, I bet I would be doing pretty well. So it doesn't make any sense. But he's making this accusation for a purpose. And we're all one man's son. They're trying to show their bona fides or their credentials. We are true men. Thy servants are no spies. In other words, a spy is not a true man. We're just average people, I think is what they mean. And he said unto them, Nay, but to see the nakedness of the land you're come, to try to find out our vulnerabilities, right? It's a military purpose. Now, he knew that wasn't true. What's he doing? He's testing them. Probably having a little fun too. But anyway, he's testing. And they said, Thy servants are 12 brethren. Oh, this is interesting, isn't it? All right, they're giving the number of kids, and they said, Thy servants are 12 brethren, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father. And one is not. You know those words. Those words had to sting. I mean, Joseph, how could he contain himself? Well, he can't. We'll see he can't contain himself emotionally eventually. But one is not. So now he mentions the younger one. That's Benjamin. And Joseph said unto them, That is that I spake unto you, saying, Ye are spies. Hereby you shall be proved. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not go forth hence, except your youngest brother come hither. He wants them to finagle it around to get Benjamin to come. Of course, he loves Benjamin. That's his brother. They have no idea with whom they're dealing. And send one of you and let him fetch your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be proved. And they would deserve to stay in prison. That's the least he could do, right? Whether there be any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely ye are spies. And he put them all together into ward 3 days. And Joseph said unto them the third day, This do and live, for I fear God. If ye be true men, let one of your brethren be bound in the house of your prison. Go ye carry corn for the famine of your houses. But bring your youngest brother unto me, so your word shall be verified, and ye shall not die. And they did so. So here, again, epistemology, if you study the knowledge question in Scripture, here's a question of verification. Proof. Is it the greatest proof in the world? It's practical proof that would suffice in a courtroom, right? If you can show me that you are just a family as you claim and not a bunch of spies who feign to be a family, you can prove that by bringing that boy up here. This is, of course, he's got other reasons. Bring your youngest brother to me, so your words be verified, and ye shall not die. And they did so. And they said one to another, We are verily guilty concerning our brother, and whom that we saw the anguish of his soul. Do they have a conscience? They did wrong to their brother, and now it's coming back to haunt them. And they feel it. They don't know they're dealing with him. They think he's dead probably, or a slave. When he besought us, and we would not hear, therefore is this distress come upon us. Were they right in that assessment? Well, yeah. They did not know how right they are or were. And Reuben answered, saying, Spake I not unto thee, saying, Do not sin against the child. Those are words for many sermons preached today, and we need to preach them in our era when children are being abused by the elite and by the powerful and the rich and by many other commoners as well. And children are not protected as they once were because Christianity is being forgotten quickly. Do not sin against the child, and you would not hear. Therefore, behold, also his blood is required. Reuben was planning to go back and get him out of the pit. When this whole thing is over and you get over being angry with him, I'm going to take him back home. But he was gone, sold off into slavery. And they knew not that Joseph understood them. See, he spake unto them by an interpreter. This was to keep up the ruse. So he had an interpreter who knew Hebrew, was telling him what these Hebrews were saying, and he was pretending like he didn't know. But he understood every word they were saying because he spoke the language. It was his language. And he turned himself about from them and wept and returned to them again. I can always imagine him going behind a curtain or something and communed with them and took from them Simeon and bound him before their eyes. So He said, one of you's got to stay in prison. I'll let the rest of you go back with the corn, but bring Benjamin if you want to rescue Simeon. So we better stop. It's already 11 o'clock. I'm sorry to go over, but this is such a fascinating study. Somebody help remember verse 25 and the intrigue with the sacks of corn and so on. How do you feel about reading? I mean, what do you think about this narrative from the Old Testament? It happened so long ago, but yet it's still so alive, is it not?
I've never been able to teach this to my class without crying.
It is emotional because it touches the tenderest chord all of us have, about our own families. I mean, just what if it had happened to us that way? And the providence of God, once we finish this, we may go back, try to review it, summarize it, and just see the providence of God as it was carried out over this extended period of time. And all these many different, seemingly unrelated details, seemingly. Thank y'all.